Joel Raines had a rule about getting involved in other people's problems. Don't. It was not a rule born of indifference. It was a rule born of experience, specifically the experience of being 23 years old and watching his uncle lose everything he owned because he had co-signed a loan for a friend who turned out to be the kind of friend who borrows money with every intention of paying it back right up until the moment he doesn't. Joel had watched his uncle's face across a kitchen table in Cleveland on a Sunday afternoon and understood something that took most people much longer to learn, that the space between knowing something is wrong and being the one to do something about it is a space that can cost you more than you planned to spend. So he had developed the rule: stay in your lane, do your job, process what you are asked to process, file what you are asked to file. And when you see something that doesn't add up, note it, flag it through the appropriate channel, and let the appropriate people handle it. He had followed this rule for 6 years without incident. And then he had met Brennan Carter. Joel had joined Carter Financial Group at 26, 2 years out of a mid-tier accounting program, with the kind of resume that was not remarkable, but was solid. The resume of someone who was precise and reliable and unlikely to surprise you, which in the financial world was often more valuable than brilliance. Brennan had hired him after a 20-minute interview in which Joel had answered every question correctly, and Brennan had said, at the end, "You're not going to tell me what I want to hear, are you?" And Joel had said, "No, probably not." And Brennan had said, "Good, I can get that anywhere," and had offered him the job. For 2 years, the arrangement had worked. Joel was good at his work. He processed, he filed, he flagged discrepancies through the appropriate channels and received appropriate responses and moved on. He had liked working for Brennan in the specific, uncomplicated way that you like working for someone who is demanding and consistent and whose standards are high enough that meeting them means something. He had not thought of Brennan as a friend. He had not thought of him as a mentor. He had thought of him as an employer whose expectations were clear and whose approval, when it came, was earned. He had not thought, in 2 years, that Brennan Carter was capable of what the Meridian documents described. The first transfer had come across his desk on a Tuesday morning in March, 14 months before the wedding. It was a routine-looking document, an asset allocation to a third-party entity, formatted the way these documents were formatted, with the appropriate signatures in the appropriate places. Joel had processed dozens like it. He had begun the standard verification and had noticed, 40 minutes into the process, that the third-party entity, a Delaware LLC, called Meridian Consulting Group, had been registered 6 weeks earlier, under a name that was not Brennan's, but that appeared on the registration documents Joel pulled from the state database, alongside a secondary contact email that Joel recognized. He had sat with that for a long moment. Then he had pulled the full filing history for Meridian Consulting Group and had found 3 additional transfers dated across the previous 4 months, totaling a number that was not small. And he had cross-referenced those transfers against the financial disclosures Brennan had submitted in the divorce proceedings that Joel had not known about until that moment, because Brennan did not discuss his personal life at the office, and had found that the number on the disclosures was significantly different from the number represented by the transfers. He had flagged it. Internal memo, standard format, marked for review. He had sent it to Brennan's office and received, the following morning, a response that was 3 sentences long. The transfers are properly structured. The discrepancy is accounted for. Remove the flag. Joel had removed the flag. He had also, before removing it, made copies of everything. He had not done this with a plan. He had done it the way a person does something when the part of them that knows better operates faster than the part of them that is afraid automatically. Quietly, the copies saved to a personal drive he kept at home, and then he had removed the flag and processed the next item in his queue and told himself that the appropriate people had reviewed it and found it appropriate, and that was the end of his responsibility. 3 weeks later, he had been called into Brennan's office and told that his contract was being concluded, effective immediately, with 2 months severance and a standard non-disclosure agreement. He had looked at Brennan across the desk, and Brennan had looked back at him with the expression of a man who has made a calculation and found it to be correct. And Joel had understood then, not suspected, understood exactly why he was being let go. He had signed the non-disclosure agreement. He had driven home with the severance paperwork on the passenger seat and had sat in his car in the parking lot of his apartment building for 23 minutes, staring at the middle distance before going inside. He had not done anything with the copies for 8 months. The non-disclosure agreement was the thing he came back to, again and again, in those 8 months. He was not a lawyer. He had read the document carefully. He read everything carefully. It was the core competency that had gotten him the job in the first place, and he understood what it said and what it did not say. It prohibited him from disclosing confidential business information related to Carter Financial Group's operations. It did not, as far as he could determine, prohibit him from providing evidence of potential financial fraud to parties who had a direct legal interest in that evidence. But he was not a lawyer, and the gap between what he thought the document said and what a court might determine it said was a gap he could not measure with any confidence. And Brennan Carter had lawyers who were considerably better than anything Joel could afford on a 26-year-old severance package. So he had waited. He had taken the contract work with the events firm, a lateral move that paid less and meant less, but that kept him in the professional world he knew and gave him time to think. He had thought. He had read about the divorce proceedings, the little that was publicly available. He had found Celeste's name in a filing, had looked her up, had found nothing, no social media presence, no professional profile, nothing that told him where she was, or how she was, or whether she had an attorney who might know how to use what he had. He had almost convinced himself, by month 7, that he was not going to do anything. And then he had seen the wedding announcement. Not a formal announcement, a mention in a business column, the kind of item that appears when a man of Brennan's profile is about to marry into the Whitfield family, and the business press considers this relevant to its readership. Joel had read it on a Wednesday evening over a bowl of soup he was not tasting, and he had felt something move in him that he did not have a clean name for. Not outrage, because outrage had faded months ago, but something closer to refusal. A refusal to let the timeline proceed the way it was proceeding. A refusal to watch Brennan Carter walk into the next chapter of his life, while Celeste, whoever she was, wherever she was, remained in the chapter he had arranged for her. He had spent a week locating her address. Then he had spent another week writing and rewriting a note that was, in the end, 9 words. "You deserve to know the truth," followed by his initial. He had mailed the envelope on a Monday. He had not slept well for the 3 days after. He had not told Celeste about the events firm contract when he sent the envelope. He had not been sure, at that point, that he was going to do anything beyond give her the documents and let her make her own choices. But when she had called him 2 days after the envelope arrived, her voice steadier than he had expected, and asked him directly what he knew and what he was able to do, he had told her about the contract, about the access it gave him, about the staff list. There had been a silence on the phone. Then she had said, "Are you sure about this?" And he had thought about his uncle's kitchen table, and the Sunday afternoon, and the face of a man who had learned too late that doing nothing was also a choice with consequences. "Yes," he had said, "I am sure." He met her at the side entrance at 6:45 and pressed the badge into her hand and told her about Arthur Langford and the Meridian deal, and watched her face process the information with the focused calm of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and is simply collecting the last pieces of what they need. She asked him why he was doing it. He told her, "Because I processed the transfers. Because I flagged them and was told to unflag them. Because I was let go. And because she was 6 months pregnant and the settlement pretended otherwise." What he did not tell her, what he could not have articulated clearly enough to say, standing in a service corridor with a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt and 15 minutes before he needed to be back inside, was the other thing. The thing that had lived underneath the 8 months of waiting and the non-disclosure agreement and the careful legal calculation about what he was and was not permitted to do. He had processed those transfers. He had flagged them and been told to unflag them, and he had unflagged them. He had been, for the duration of the time his hands were on those documents, a participant in what Brennan had done, not the architect, not the beneficiary, but not entirely clean either. And he had lived with that for 8 months, in the particular way that people live with the things they have done that they cannot undo, not constantly, not dramatically, but always there, in the background, in the specific quality of silence that settles over a decision you have not yet made peace with. Giving Celeste the envelope was not absolution. He understood that. He was not naive enough to believe that doing the right thing now erased the fact that he had taken 8 months to get here, or that he had unflagged the notation in the first place, or that he had signed the non-disclosure agreement without consulting an attorney. But it was something. It was the thing he could still do, and he was going to do it. Go in through the kitchen corridor, he told her. Stay near the back. You do not have to do anything tonight. I just needed you to have the choice. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression he could not read. Then she clipped the badge to her purse and went through the door. He spent the next 3 hours in a state of suspended alertness that he had never experienced before and hoped never to experience again. He circulated as his role required checking in with the catering coordinator, confirming the timeline with the AV team, doing the small logistical tasks that justified his presence and kept him moving through the room. He kept Celeste in his peripheral vision at all times. He noted Arthur Langford at table 4 and felt the specific, complicated relief of seeing a piece of the plan he had not entirely controlled fall into place. He approached Celeste twice during the reception. The first time to tell her about Langford, the second time just before 9:30, when he could see from across the room that Brennan's composure was deteriorating, to offer her the alternative. To remind her that it did not have to happen here, that he could still route the documents to Langford's attorney through other channels, that tonight was not the only option. She had said, I know it does not have to. That is not why I am doing it. He had stepped back. He had understood, in that moment, that what she was doing was not exactly the same thing he was doing. He was correcting a record. She was reclaiming a story. Those were related but not identical, and the distinction mattered, and he had no standing to redirect her. He had said okay, and stepped back, and watched. He saw Brennan grab her dress from 30 feet away. He had been moving towards Celeste's position, some instinct, some reading of Brennan's trajectory that his body had processed before his mind caught up when it happened. The sound, the silence. 300 people holding their breath. He stopped where he was. He watched Celeste stumble, catch herself, straighten. He watched the room. He watched Brennan standing with his hand open at his side. The expression on his face. The expression of a man who has just made a catastrophic error and knows it, and he felt something that was not satisfaction. He had expected satisfaction and found something more complicated, something closer to the exhausted recognition of a thing you knew was true being confirmed in the most expensive possible way. Celeste walked to the stage. Joel stood near the kitchen corridor entrance and listened to her speak. He had read the documents so many times that he knew what she was going to say before she said it, but hearing it in her voice, in that room, through those speakers, to 300 people who had come here to celebrate the man she was describing was different from reading it. It was the difference between knowing something and understanding it. He watched Arthur Langford stand up. He watched Brennan attempt a rebuttal. He watched Whitley say stop. He watched Celeste walk to Whitley, say something quiet, and turn toward the exit. And then he crossed to the table, where she had left the documents, picked up the envelope, and held it. She found his eyes from across the room and gave him a small nod, the nod of someone who has done what they came to do and trusts you to know what to do with the rest. He nodded back. He was still holding the envelope when Arthur Langford appeared at his elbow. Langford was a man who did not waste time on preamble. He looked at the envelope and then at Joel and said, "You processed the Meridian transfers." It was not a question. "Yes," Joel said. Langford held his gaze for a moment with the appraising directness of a man who has spent 40 years reading people in rooms like this one and has gotten very good at it. Then he said, "I am going to need you to sit down with my attorney." Joel looked at the envelope in his hand. He thought about the non-disclosure agreement. He thought about the 8 months. He thought about his uncle's kitchen table and the Sunday afternoon and the face of a man who had learned too late that doing nothing was also a choice. "Yes," he said, "I know." He stayed until the room had mostly cleared. Not because he was needed, his role had ended. Practically speaking, the moment Celeste walked out the door, he stayed because leaving felt wrong, felt like the abrupt conclusion of something that deserved a slightly longer ending. He collected his things from the staff room. He returned the walkie-talkie. He changed out of the event's staff shirt in the bathroom and stood at the sink for a moment, looking at his own face in the mirror. He looked tired. He was tired. He had been tired, he realized, for 8 months, carrying the specific exhaustion of a person who knows something they have not yet decided what to do with. He did not feel that exhaustion anymore. He felt something else, something that was not quite relief and not quite resolution, but was in the neighborhood of both. The feeling of a weight set down, not removed, because some of it was his, to keep the unflagged notation, the 8 months, the signature on the non-disclosure agreement. Those were his, and he would carry them, and they were the cost of having taken this long to get here. But the thing he had been holding for Celeste, the 4 pages of documents, the evidence of what had been done to her that was no longer his to hold. He had given it to her, and she had used it, and now it was in the hands of people with the authority and the resources to do what needed to be done with it. He walked out of the venue into the cool night air. The circular drive was quiet. A few guests were still filtering out small groups, quiet conversations, the particular subdued energy of people who have witnessed something they will be processing for a long time. No one looked at him. He was, as he had always been in that building, a man in a staff shirt performing a function, visible only insofar as the function required. He walked to his car. He sat in it for a moment, without starting the engine. He thought about calling someone, his mother, maybe, or the friend from his accounting program he still had lunch with twice a year. He did not call anyone. There was nothing to say that could be said quickly, and he was too tired for the version that required explanation. He started the car and drove home. He would call Langford's attorney in the morning. He would review the non-disclosure agreement with a lawyer of his own. He had already identified one, had been waiting for the moment when the decision was made and the next steps required actual steps. He would give them everything he had. He would be honest about his role, including the parts that did not reflect well on him, because honesty about the parts that did not reflect well on you was the only version of honesty that meant anything. He would do all of that in the morning. Tonight, he drove home through the ordinary city, through the indifferent streets, past the lit windows of people living their lives inside their own stories, and he felt, underneath the exhaustion and the complicated weight of what the evening had cost, a quietness he had not felt in a very long time. He had done the right thing. It had taken him 8 months longer than it should have, and he would live with that, and he had done it. That was going to have to be enough.